Hi, I'm Chris Cochran, the Executive Director of Entrepreneurs Across Borders. And the video that you're about to watch might actually change your life. I know it'll change your business. Recently, our founder, Martin Babinec, had an opportunity to sit down with his good friend, Brad Feld, and talk about the power of mentorship based on his new book, Give First. Give First is a masterclass, not only in giving, but receiving mentorship and why it's so important in the life of an entrepreneur. You'll hear about Brad's journey, you'll hear about his story, and you might even find some opportunities to give back to your own community through the power of giving first. Let's watch.
It's my pleasure to extend our greetings from downtown Little Falls, New York, with our being in Rock City Center, right across the street from City Hall. And with me, a very special guest, Brad Feld, longtime friend, and a person who I have a lot of shared experiences with. So it's a really, really special opportunity for me to have a chat, to talk about not just some of the things he has done as an investor, but even more so as a founder. I think there's a lot of founder storytelling to be had that is profiled in the book, Give First. It'll be the major theme that we'll be trying to chat here for the next 45, 50 minutes, whilst trying to reserve some time for Q&A at the end. So before we get started with my firing questions, let me point out that Brad, while most well known as an investor through Foundry Group and other VCs, and also the co-founder of Techstars, his background as a founder goes much deeper than that, both with companies and, importantly, social impact nonprofits that go near and dear to my heart as things that help build community. We're going to talk about his work and his experiences in building Feld Technologies, his first company. We'll also have a chance to walk through his moving to Boulder and creating some connectivity there. It'll be fun. And the formation of Foundry Group and Techstars. But I'll also point out that nonprofits that he's helped start include creating chapters for Entrepreneurs Organization in Boston and then in Boulder. The Entrepreneurs Foundation of Colorado, which we'll speak about at the end of our discussion today. The National Center for Women in Information Technology, the Social Venture Partners, as well as Energize Colorado, which he started during COVID to help small businesses and made a huge difference in keeping many of those small businesses afloat during challenging times, and also his family foundation, Anchor Point. So these are all nonprofits, impact organizations that at the end of the day recognize his talents as a founder, in particular creating organizations which somebody else runs and are still sustaining today. And it's an element of being a founder that I think adds to the overall discussion of, well, what is Give First? So let's back it up a bit. And I will actually say that in my reading the book, even though, Brad, we've known each other since 1993, I want to say. You know, it's a long time. From reading the book and listening to the recent podcast, you can visit Give First as a podcast on any of your podcast platforms. And the recent 2 issues of that podcast go into some interesting history that we'll touch on briefly, but encourage everybody to check that podcast out when you have time. So I'm reading the book, listening to podcasts, and came up with some tidbits that I didn't even think about before that'll weave into our conversation. So but let's begin with the beginning, and what led to your starting Feld Technologies?
So I started Feld Technologies when I was in college, and I hadn't really ever thought about getting a job. Hadn't really ever thought about a career. I just kind of started. Entrepreneurship, and you remember this time frame, entrepreneurship wasn't really a word that described anything back in the 1980s, mid-1980s. Like there were some companies like Apple Computer, you know, and you'd talk about things like Intel, and occasionally Starbucks would be another company that would come up sort of in the same time frame. But as a college student, it just really wasn't front and center. And the way I ended up kind of being involved in it was the first company I worked for, which I worked for my senior year in high school and then worked for the first 2 years of college, was a startup, a husband and wife software company that wrote software for the oil and gas industry. It's called Petcom. And Chris and Helena Aves were the founders. And they were really powerful early mentors of mine without me really realizing what was going on. Like they took this 17-year-old teenager under their wing. I wrote software products for them, for their company. Chris, the CEO, also wrote software. And it was kind of an introduction to this idea of like just creating a company out of nothing. When I was in college, I ended up starting a couple of other companies before Feld Technologies that failed. And so I described Feld Technologies as my first successful company. But I actually started a company with a couple of college friends called Martingale Software when the Mac came out, Apple Macintosh first came out. And I found recently some of that old stuff from that, the documents we've written. And it's kind of wild to like read some of the old stuff and remember from that, like the feeling of just being able to create something from nothing was so powerful and being unconstrained by previous thinking. That first company that was successful, Feld Technology, Martingale Software failed. I had another company called DataVision that I started with a client of Chris and Helena's at Petcom, a guy named Gabriel Prieto. And we wrote a piece of software to do something called cephalographic analysis. And the reason that you've never heard of cephalographic analysis is we had one customer who was the guy who invented cephalographic analysis, and he paid us nothing to develop the product because, he was the first customer. We never found a second customer, so the company failed. So I had these early lessons that were powerful on the positive about the idea of starting a company, also powerful on the sort of, I have to do something that somebody cares about. And on the back end of all of that, it's not working. Okay, well, why not? Try to figure out why it's not working. And that's okay that it's not working. Like, keep trying to figure out where it's going.
So you learn from those experiences. You start Feld Technologies. That started to get some traction. And then there were challenges. So tell us about some of your most significant challenges and who helped you in a way that was meaningful.
Early in that company, we made a couple of mistakes that were pretty profound. The first is we had no money. So the company was funded with $10. I provided 6 of it, Dave provided 3 of it, and my dad provided $1. That's how we split the stock up, 60, 30, 10. But we really had no investment capital. We then quickly hired a half a dozen part-time people over the summer who were my college friends, and we started doing a bunch of stuff. But we were doing a bunch of stuff that we weren't getting paid for. We didn't have any money. And we very quickly realized that we had a little consulting client here, consulting client there. So we had a little revenue coming in, but not nearly enough to cover what was going out. And my father had co-signed, personally guaranteed a loan for us, which was a $25,000 loan. And we kind of spent most of that money in the first couple of months. And realized, the conversation was kind of like, no, I'm not going to do more. And it's not really his money. He's just personally guaranteeing it from a bank. And okay. So we laid everybody off. Just Dave and I sort of retrenched. And we focused very early on making sure that every month we had more money coming in than was going out. It's kind of basic business 101, but we really hadn't incorporated that in our thinking when we got started. Now, my father, as an advisor to us, and really, he's a partner in the business, but he played an advisory role, was really helpful in that moment because he wasn't critical. He didn't say, you're doing the wrong thing, or I don't agree with what you're doing. He said, some version of, kids, think hard about what's going on here. If you want to be around in a couple of months, you got to figure out how to do something that somebody wants to pay you for. So that was kind of foundational at the beginning. I remember when it was hard when Dave and I told all of our friends, you don't have jobs anymore. And we kind of retrenched. We had an office. We'd actually rented an office, and we had to get out of the lease. Landlord was very friendly, fortunately, so we were able to get out of the lease. And then over the next year, every month we made a small amount more than we spent, $1,000, $2,000. But by the end of the year, we paid back all the bank debt. We were back sort of on our footing. And we started to understand what we were doing. We started to have a vision and a focus for what we were trying to accomplish. And I remember maybe a year and a half later, we hired our first employee, a guy named Sean Broderick. And we were both really nervous about hiring Sean because we had this experience where we'd added some people and then had to lay him off. And we had that conversation with Sean up front. And he kind of said, look, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's okay. He was 21 or 22. Like, I just want to go on this journey with you guys. It's going to be fun. And off we went. So that sort of fundamental experience of almost failing, almost dying at the beginning, and sort of figuring out what you had to do to build a base that you could build on really came from that experience.
And that is the story of every entrepreneur. Gets started with great ambition. Not hard to spend
and
money.
And then run into reality.
Yeah, it's like, well, $25,000 went pretty quick, guys. Right?
I think it was gone in a month or two.
Right? And so you're trucking along, and then lo and behold, in 1991, Birthing a Giants, you mentioned in the book, you went to this program called Birthing a Giants. And you say in the book that this was a seminal moment. And so tell us about what was that program and why was it important in your development?
So it's kind of an amazing moment in time. So we're now probably just about $1 million a year business. So we're a real business now. We've got a dozen people. We've got a lot of customers. We've got a lot of stuff going on. Every day is stressful. We're working long hours. I mean, probably at this point it's 100-hour weeks for Dave and I. We had a culture where we didn't really want all the people that work for us to work that way. We wanted them to choose how much they wanted to work. So I think most people work, 40 to 60 hours a week on a regular week. But it was focused. It was really intense. But I had no peers. Like, I didn't know anyone that was running a company like me. I had no interactions with them. Some of our clients, I kind of had a relationship with whoever was the CEO or the leader of the business, but not really. Like, it was a client relationship. They were paying us to do something for them. So they might have liked me. We might have had a friendship, but it wasn't really the same kind of thing because I couldn't kind of say, well, I'm really scared that I can't make payroll this month. Like, that was not the thing you said to the customer.
Clients are not peers.
No, it was a different relationship. And so I was lonely.
Yeah.
And I had Dave, my partner. I had my dad, who was we were in Boston. He was in Dallas, so I could call him and talk to him. But it was still my dad. It was my paternalistic relationship. He cared about me, and he had his own business, which was he was a medical doctor, but he had a pretty big medical practice. So we could talk about business stuff, but it was still parental guidance rather than just somebody I could hang out with and say, I'm scared shitless about what's going to happen, or I'm so stressed because of this, that, or the other thing, or I have this thing I want to do and I really just don't know how to put it together, or how did you deal with this? I have this problem. How did you deal with it? I see this advertisement in a magazine called Inc. Magazine, which is still around, but at the time it was the only thing for entrepreneurs. There was no real entrepreneurial anything to read. There's obviously no internet, so you get a magazine. And I would read it cover to cover every month, but it never, like, I kind of looked up to these people. It's like, oh my God, if I could only one day meet these people. And I see this advertisement. It's a one-page advertisement for this thing called Birthing of Giants. And the qualifications are you have to have a company with $1 million of revenue, you have to be under 40, and you have to be a founder. And we had less than $1 million of revenue, maybe $900,000, $950,000 revenue. I'm like, what the hell? I'll apply. Apply. We get in. I have this experience over a 4-day weekend at MIT Endicott House, led by Vern Harnish. That was transformative. It was the first time, there were 60 people there, it was the first time I was with my people. Like, these were other founders. And they ranged. I was one of the smallest companies there. One of the companies was a $500 million company. There were a bunch of companies that were, $5 to $50 million companies. And there were a number of companies that were small like mine. A number of years later, I told Vern, I said to him, hey, I was under $1 million that first year. Why did you let me in? And he said, Brad, we let everybody in. But it was this moment where over the weekend, all of a sudden, and it wasn't, like a drunken party weekend. It was just hanging out, talking late into the night about the stuff in people's businesses. And there was a little, at the very beginning, the first night, there was a little checking each other out, like, what's your business and how big is your company and what's the this and what's the that. But by the second day, that was gone. And everybody was just kind of there talking about their issues, being willing to deal with your issues. For me, one of the biggest problems I was struggling with that weekend, I'd never fired anybody other than that first group of people, that were the part-time people that we laid off. And we had a person on our team that needed to be fired. And I was, again, 12 people. I was terrified of firing the person. Not just the process of it, but like, well, how's it going to feel? And we're a family, and how's it, what's that going to mean? And the advice I got, the ability to, and not even advice you should do this, but the ability to have the conversation, well, when I fired my first person, blah, and some of it was cliches, like, oh, I never regretted firing somebody that wasn't working. But just like going through those and talking to other founders and hearing them explain to me their situations was that related to this problem that I was having was fantastic. So I came back to Boston after that, and I think probably we did fire the person pretty quickly afterward, but for maybe a month or two, I had this seed that was planted that started to grow, which is, what founders need? Founders need other founders.
Yes.
They just do. It's a hard, lonely thing. And they need other founders to be not just friends with, but to have a different kind of relationship. And so, in my early 20s, I was starting to think about this without really knowing what it was.
So that led to starting what today is called EO Boston, but we were then Young Entrepreneurs. When did that get kicked off?
Why EO came next from Birthing a Giant? So Birthing a Giants was affiliated, sort of loosely affiliated with a couple of other things that Vern was working on at the time and involved. And one was this organization called Young Entrepreneurs Organization. It was about 100 people at the time. And it was interesting. It was about 50% Canadian, 50% U.S. So it was a cross-border thing. It was kind of sort of related to Young Presidents Organization, which was more established, but it wasn't really. It wasn't a spin-off. It was just kind of modeled after it. It's a little bit of overlap. And I joined right out of Birthing a Giants. It was a lot of money for me. It was a couple $1,000s, I think, a year to join. And I was very loath even to spend the money to go to Birthing a Giants because we're trying to make money every month.
Sure.
And I wasn't comfortable really as a founder spending money on me, right? That was always a little bit of a struggle in the context of the business at that point. But my partner Dave encouraged it and supported this idea of, look, Brad, you're getting something from this. You've got a lonely job. This is important. And I joined YEO, and they had a couple of chapters in the U.S., one in New York. A guy named Doug Mellinger, who we know for a long time, I think had started that chapter, I think. And I just started a Boston chapter. I'm like, all right, let's just go find some people in Boston where I was living that are like this. And it happened very fast, and it was not hard to find the first 20 or 30 people.
Once you went out and started looking.
Yeah,
they were
there just everywhere.
But you gave them a reason to start coming together.
And that was the thing. And that was the thing that was so interesting to me was it wasn't like I felt totally alone, and I was starved for this kind of connection. All I had to do was look around, and there were lots of other people that had all kinds of different businesses that were starved for the same kind of connection. And off it went. I ended up being on the YEO board for a number of years. With a guy named Bill Ritchie, we introduced the internet to YEO. YEO was one of the first organizations that had a website. I actually went and looked at the website on the Wayback Machine recently. It's quite amazing to remember. I looked at it, I'm like, yep, I remember making that website. We introduced email to everybody, and all of a sudden YEO's running on email in the late 80s when nobody, or maybe early 90s when nobody's really running on email yet. The internet's not a thing. It was pretty awesome. And what happened, and you had this experience too with me, as that group of peers got bigger and more vibrant, more diverse, different businesses, different people, different geographies, different experiences, there was some magic that started to happen where it wasn't only that you no longer felt alone, but you understood the impact you were having by being a founder and by leading a business and by growing a business, not just through the success of your own business, and a lot of the businesses didn't succeed, plenty of them failed, so then you had a support system of you're struggling with this or struggling with that. But you could see how those leaders and those founders, as they grew some and matured over time, started to have more ambition, not just around their business, but around things that impacted where they were, the communities they were in, the people that they worked with.
1993, Ameridata acquires
Yep.
Feld Technologies. And so now you're a young founder working in a large corporate. Tell us about that experience, and specifically including who helped you inside Ameridata that set the stage or another building block towards Give First.
Yep. So Ameridata was a corporation, but it was also a startup. The two founders, who are the two co-chair, Len Fassler and Jerry Pock, who were the guys that I think of as buying that for my first company, and both became extremely good friends. Len passed a few years ago. Jerry, I actually texted with him the other day about something. They were accomplished founders. This was not their first company. The company that they were running at the time that it bought Feld Technologies was called Sage Alerting Systems. They ended up buying a company called Ameridata and changed the name. My company was Feld Technologies. They bought a company called Ameridata, and then the parent became Ameridata Technology. So I like to joke that they used the technologies part of my company on it. Ameridata was a much, much larger company. They also bought about 40 companies in 3 years, and we were the 7th company that they acquired. So they're very, very rapid deal making, lots of chaos, lots of stuff I had no exposure to. And I was extremely fortunate to have my life intersect with them for lots of reasons. One was it was a good time for us to sell the business. Like we had gotten to a point with the business where it was a couple $1 million a year in revenue. It was very profitable, but we were struggling with the next phase of growth. I had never done any deals. I'd never made an investment. I'd never bought a company. I never even thought about it. And this time with them both gave me some financial resources to be an angel investor. And so I became an angel investor in the 1994 to 96 time period, which was at the very beginning of the rise of the commercial internet. And I did a lot of investments. I was doing about an investment a month. I was in my late 20s in Boston. And so all of a sudden I was one of the first people in my cohort to have a company acquired. And so all of a sudden, a bunch of the other founders wanted to spend time with me. I could invest in their companies. I could be an advisor. I could do whatever. So like a lot of foundational things happened in that moment, both that I liked and that I didn't like. So I had to sort of sort my way through it. But the really powerful thing was the relationship that evolved with both Jerry and Len. With Jerry, I learned a ton of stuff and spent a lot of time kind of the cliche at his feet, right? With him in meetings, watching him, observing him, learning from him, helping and engaging, but sort of behind the scenes. With Len, he kind of very quickly kind of put his arm around me and said, "Come on, let's go." And Len was about 30, a little bit over 30 years older than me. And he really gave me a front row seat at the way he was thinking about what he was doing. And it wasn't just, let me teach you. It was, let me get you involved. Let me do these things with you. And it was something that very, very quickly generated a level of emotional intimacy that I had never had before in a business context. A very close personal relationship with my first partner, Dave. Of course, my father, very close personal relationship. But this was a person that I didn't know. had spent very little time with, and just I felt this warm embrace that allowed me to go up this learning curve incredibly fast on a bunch of stuff.
Because they were doing a lot of deals, so there was some sophistication to do that many deals,
Yeah.
right? That required understanding of investment, cap tables, all these things that were a foundation then for your investing side in a way.
And it wasn't just that, but it was also being able to see what worked and what didn't work after the deal.
Yes.
Because lots of the deals they did worked when they bought a company, but they definitely had some that didn't. And there were lots of things that they did that were really effective. And there were some things, whereas somebody from the outside looking in that was fresh eyes on them would be like, what's going on here?
But it also strikes me, Brad, when I think about all that you have going on at that point. You're inside Ameridata. You're making your own investments as an angel. You're learning a lot from people that you respect. I mean, there's a lot going on there. And yet you still are active in trying to grow entrepreneurial community. You're helping not only EO Boston, you're in discussion, I think, at that point with the Kauffman Foundation.
Yep.
And we met in 1993 as I started my first year of Birthing a Giants, which was also hugely impactful for me. And I'm still in touch with many of those people from that particular experience. So we meet, and you start working with Kauffman. You start helping Kauffman create a think tank, essentially, of high-growth entrepreneurs to guide the development of EO. And somehow you thought I was going to be able to contribute to that. I don't know. Go figure.
You were wonderful.
All right. But I met a lot of good people through that experience as well. And I was busy trying to grow TriNet at that point. I got a full plate and a growing family. But you found time to still make this commitment to help founders get connected. So what was in it for you? Because you had a lot of demands.
Yeah.
All right. You had a lot of demands going on in your life.
Well, so I think a spark had been lit somewhere in that time period, and I don't know exactly, when in that time period this particular spark was lit. I do know. I describe a thing I call the moment. I do know when it crystallized in my mind.
Okay.
And that happened about 2001 with Len. But in this 92, 93, 94, 95 time period, I was in this shift from realizing that I was getting immense joy from being a starter of things, from being a convener of things, of being somebody who, oh, you're a founder, let me help you. As a founder, not as a something else. Let me help you as an angel investor. Let me help you as a peer in your network. I didn't have these words for any of this stuff.
Okay.
But I was getting a lot of joy from it, and I was learning a ton. And for me, I think my biggest motivation in a work context, and people have different motivations, has always been learning. I've been fortunate. I've been financially successful. I've built some good businesses. I've had some things that have failed, and I've had some really big struggles that I've had to learn about myself through. But in that, when I sort of distill it all, that spark was, wow, this is really fun. This is really interesting. And it's not really how big the company gets. It's not really how much money it makes. It's not really how much power it has. I've never been a fan of the Silicon Valley change the world phrase. I think, there's kind of one person that gets to say, I'm going to put a dent in the universe, and that's Steve Jobs. I think everybody that's come after that says that is actually, it's a cliche. It's like that was his line. And there are many, many founders who put dents in the universe. But for me, it wasn't, and it has to be this enormous externally viewed thing. It's much more of this internal, bottom-up, engage with lots of people. Whether it's you call it an ethos or a philosophy or a spirit or a way of being, this notion that this stuff is hard.
Yes, it is.
And, when you see the success, you can say, oh, well, the person's successful. Look at what happened. But that's not the satisfying part. The part is from the beginning to the end. So something happened in this time period for me where that became exciting, not in the absence of doing the work, but in addition to doing the work.
You've mentioned in the book that through this time period, the thoughts that today we call give first started to coalesce in this time period, that even by the time you got to write the book Startup Communities, and you called it Give Before You Get, but it was the same philosophy of, hey, there is satisfaction that comes by helping others, especially founders. So why don't we maybe shift here a little bit to have you unpack the definition of Give First?
Sure.
Like, how do we define Give First, and why don't we start there? Okay.
So it's important to understand that Give First is a philosophy.
Okay.
And in a philosophy, it's not a set of rules to follow. It's a frame of reference to incorporate your own way into what you do. Religion is a set of rules that you follow. In any religious tradition, since man started creating religious traditions, you follow a set of rules, and you can be forgiven for breaking the rules, but if you follow the rules and you at some point you achieve whatever the religious tradition is, salvation or nirvana or whatever, it doesn't matter. But it's a rule-driven dynamic. With Give First, these are not rules. These are perspective, frame of reference. Give First definition is that you're willing to put energy into a system without knowing what you're going to get back. It's not altruistic. You expect to get something back. You just don't know from whom, over what time period, in what consideration, in what magnitude. So you're willing to invest energy. And the energy comes in lots of different ways. It's a non-transactional investment. You're not saying, I will do this if you give me this. Now, there's lots of room, and obviously lots of business is transactional. And I've been on the receiving end of, as an investor, people saying, oh, you're the Give First guy. Why don't you give me $5 million? And I'll just give you back something, when I'm successful. I'm like, no, there are definitely transactions. So it's not also an absolute. It's not that you have to spend 100% of your behavior this way. Again, not a religion, philosophy. It's that you want to incorporate into your way of being a willingness to engage in something without knowing what you're going to get back.
So we hear the term pay it forward a lot. So there's maybe a little overlap, but also some differences.
Yeah, they're cousins. They're
Okay.
cousins. And part of the reason I focus so much on the phrase Give First is I heard pay it forward in this time period, but there was something about it that didn't work for me. And it took me a little while to understand it. Pay it forward is fundamentally transactional. Someone once did something for me, and therefore I'm going to pay it forward. So there's this idea that you're linking what somebody did for you to pay it forward. Now, a lot of people don't match it. It's not like, oh, I got 1 unit of good, and now I'm going to pay forward 1 unit of good. But it sort of fit within that container. And I really wanted to create another concept that was non-transactional. It was not obligatory. There's 2 other words that are really important in the context of Give First that are different than pay it forward. One is this idea that you have a positive sum game or a positive feedback loop. In the context of pay it forward, it tends to be a value transfer, right? I'm paying it forward from value that I got somewhere along the way. With Give First, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a feedback loop moving. I'm putting energy into the thing. If multiple people can put energy into the thing, all of a sudden interesting stuff happens. And that was the experience I had with YEO and Boston and Colorado and so many other, the Kauffman work we did. All of a sudden people are just, I don't know where this is going to go, but it's interesting. And where it went and the value that came out of it was so significant, but it was unpredictable. The other concept that's really important is that it's a multi-turn game versus a single-turn game. I think a lot of people view pay it forward as somebody paid it forward for me, I'm now going to pay it forward to that person. Versus this idea that it's a multi-turn. Anybody that's played a video game, or you play a single-turn game, you play and then you lose, your quarter ran out of your video game, and you're done. Maybe you get an extra life or 2 if you shot enough ships, but now you're done. A multi-turn game is you just can kind of keep playing. Okay, that turn finished. Okay, let's try again. And entrepreneurship fundamentally is a multi-turn game.
Yep.
And, life is a multi-turn game. And so I wanted to incorporate those things in to get out of this transactional mindset completely, hence Give First.
Okay. Now, as we advance through the dot-com era, which 95 to 2000, and then you and I both kind of rode that wave up.
Man, that was awesome, wasn't it?
And then we got to the peak, and then it all went down.
Then it was awful.
All right? So as we think about the period middle of 2000 to 2001, end of 2001, anyone that was as deep in tech as both of us were at that point in time and still lived to tell the story, there's a lot to it that the next generation can learn a lot from. So how during those dark days of what I refer to as the dot bomb, how is it that you kept afloat and still kept in the game of building community?
Well, a couple of things happened that were really significant, and it's always interesting to me where people cut the time frame off. For me, I have a period that I call the grind, which went from 2002 to 2005.
Okay.
And the reason for that length of time was the pile of crap that I'd created from all the stuff that failed in the internet bubble. It was a mountain. I mean, we don't have very big mountains here. I mean, it was a mountain like in Colorado. It was just so many things. So, and on that mountain of crap, some good stuff came out of it, right? So it wasn't that everything failed, but it was just hard. There was so much of a mess because so many things got overfunded, overbuilt, didn't have business models that worked. The sort of investment capital for it vaporized. The public markets vaporized. So all the things that had built this big rise, and the rise, you remember, was kind of like over 4 or 5 years,
Yes.
and then the collapse was like in 12
Boom.
months.
Yep.
And then, you collapse, you can say, okay, I'm done. I'm like, no, I'm sitting down here with this mountain of garbage. Let me try to figure out what to do with it. So over that time period, a couple of things happened. One was, and maybe it's a cliche that misery loves company. Like if everybody's in a rough spot, there's not much posturing about it. You're like, all right, we're in a rough spot. Let's go figure it out. And of course, this wasn't just an internet problem because in 2002, I think, 2003, Enron went bankrupt, WorldCom went bankrupt, people started going to jail.
Yep.
Like it was a rough time for technology, for business, for telecom, for this notion that the internet was going to transform everything. And then suddenly it didn't. But it did. It just didn't in that time period. And so for the persistent founders, like figuring out how to navigate through and survive that was really powerful. And there were a lot of companies, and I was involved in several, that structurally just couldn't survive because of the way that they'd been capitalized or the way that they built their businesses. I found that the value, the non-transactional value of the network that I had built and the relationships and friendships that I had built with other founders was profound in that moment. Because if I had been as alone as I was, when I first started Feld Technologies in, 1987 or 88, and it had to confront that, I don't know how I would have. But now I'm confronting it with lots of other people who are confronting it, who are oriented to be emotionally and intellectually honest about what's going on rather than bullshitting each other. And, oh, it's okay, I'm killing it, it's all good, I'm about to die over here, but don't look over here. And that there's a lot of energy that comes from that that's really powerful. The other part of that for me that, and this comes back to the thing I describe as the moment, I had this spark in the 90s about how much I would learn from all the engagement with founders and how much I enjoyed it and how participating in other people's success actually created success for me, like a bunch of stuff in that. But I had a moment with Len where Len Fassler, who he and I were co-chair of this company at the time called Interalliant, which had gone public. At the peak was worth about $3 billion of the internet bubble. And in 2002 went bankrupt. Now, the business itself was a real business. I think our largest revenue year was about $200 million in revenue. And we'd started in 1996, so it grew very, very quickly. We had mastered the art of one thing, and that was losing $5 million a month. We were outstanding at that. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because at the time, the only thing that mattered was growth. And investors rewarded growth. So the faster we grew, the more the company was worth. And nobody cared about how much money you made.
Because there was always more money to raise during that
You
period.
could always raise more money.
Yep.
And the thing that ruined the company ultimately was we raised in 3 days $160 million of debt instead of equity after we were public. It was a type of deal, about 30 companies did this same deal that we did. 29 of them went bankrupt. So it was just structurally a bad financing type of deal. Merrill Lynch was the bank that promulgated that particular type of financing. There's a lot of stuff after the fact. It wasn't totally legal. It was just a dumb thing to do for these money-losing companies. If you believed that there was money always available forever, it was a good idea. But the second the money reversed, it was a terrible idea. In that experience, Len, again, is 30 years older than me. He doesn't need to be doing this. Why is he spending his time on this? You know, he's in his 70s now. He's getting up every day. He's fighting for the survival of this company. He doesn't have to do it. Doesn't need it from a financial perspective. Doesn't really need it from an ego perspective. And he's there fighting as hard as I am for the survival of the company for I'm not quite sure why. And what I realized, you know, with some distance is he's doing it because of his love and commitment for the people that he's spending time with in the context of this work. It's not an economic decision. It's a relationship decision. It's not a light commitment to engage. It's a deep commitment, regardless of what happens. And that was really profound for me. Like it brought a bright light on a lot of my values that up to that point I hadn't been able to focus on.
Adding further credence to that notion of the relationship building is that much strengthened by the give first approach in everything that you were doing. And then those relationships in Len's case were critical in the commitment that he had to get through that dark period. How about in the book, you talk about the random day interaction in 2006 with David Cohen that ultimately led to Techstars. Kind of an interesting little background. So tell us about that particular interaction and how that resulted in the creation of Techstars.
So, you know, I lived through this period I called the grind, 2002 to 2005, where I just, you know, heads down and worked on the companies I was involved in. I had about 25 companies I was involved in at the time as an investor or a co-founder. And by about 2006, like a lot of that had sorted itself out. The stuff that was not going to work had not worked. The stuff that was working, there were some good companies in that mix. And I sort of started to pick my head up. And I was doing a thing. I'd become very visible in Colorado as a founder. My wife, Amy, and I had moved there in 1995. And I had made a bunch of investments during the internet bubble, so I was well known. I continued to have money to invest through the grind. So it wasn't that I just stopped in 2002. I kept making investments, 2003, 2004, 2005. I found myself in this place where because I was so visible, everybody wanted to get together with me. And I like to be accessible. That was part of the fun of all of this and building the network and having the network continue to expand. I'd started YEO Colorado. There were probably by now 100 people involved in that. I started a thing called the Colorado Internet Keiretsu. I used the Keiretsu word from a Japanese word. I was the first venture fund I was part of was affiliated with SoftBank, which is a big Japanese company. So we played around with Americanized concepts of Japanese words all the time. And there were probably a couple hundred people that were internet-related people in Colorado that were all part of another sort of network group of founders who were working on this stuff. And it got to the point where if I responded yes to everybody who wanted to have lunch or coffee with me, all I'd do is have lunch or coffee all day. It's just impossible. And so I decided to start doing something I called random days. So one day a month, I would spend the bulk of a day having 15-minute meetings with whoever wanted to meet with me. And I created a little online calendar thing before online calendars were a thing. And you went online and you registered for a slot. Had nothing to do with it. I usually had these meetings, not always, but usually had them in public places. So, people weren't like queued up waiting to get into my office. It was more like hanging out in a coffee shop. My assistant would come, and every 15 minutes, I'd sit down with somebody and say, all right, the next 15 minutes belong to you. It's on your mind. And, there was a backlog. It would take a couple months, 3, 4, 5 months to get on the calendar sometimes. But it was really fun. And it also allowed me to then not have this kind of continual switching throughout the day of, I'm just meeting this person for 15 or 30 minutes to have coffee to meet them. I eventually learned I wanted to do 2 things in each meeting. One is I wanted to learn one thing. That was for me. The second was I wanted to connect a person to at least one other person. That was for them. And the connect was a proxy for help them in some way. Most people wanted a connection. Some people wanted a very specific piece of feedback too, but I was always trying to make sure that I didn't leave that 15 minutes without something that the other person felt like that was worth it to me. And remember, their agenda was theirs, so a lot of people would show up with no idea what to talk about. And so I'd have to figure out how to guide them to something that was actually going to be useful to them.
David had an idea.
David did. David showed up. I never met him. It took him about 3 months to get on my calendar. He slid a piece of paper across the desk to me and started talking. And I can't read and listen very well at the same time. I have to do one or the other, and I prefer to read. So I said to David, let me read this. Give me a sec. I read it, and it was a very lightweight description of what Techstars was going to be. Just an idea. He'd been an angel investor. He'd made some angel investments. After selling his first company, it wasn't very satisfying to him to be an angel investor. He thought there must be a better way, and he wanted to put together a group of about 10 companies for a summer, fund them, and hang out with them for the summer and help them get their companies up and off the ground with the hope that a couple of them would turn into something interesting.
And what was his ask for you?
Well, he didn't really have an ask. So I said to him, this is awesome. How can I get involved? And he said, well, I'm putting in a little bit of money. My business partner is putting in a little bit of money. This was his business partner from the company he'd sold. And we just need a little bit more money, and I just want to find another 1 or 2 people to put some money in. And I said to him, I'll match your partner, David. I'll put that amount. And hang on a second. And so I walked out of the room at about minute 5. I made a phone call to a guy named Jared Polis. Jared is now governor of Colorado, but he was a founder, had built several very successful companies.
And was part of EO Colorado.
He was early member of EO Colorado. He may have actually been the youngest member of EO Colorado when we started the chapter. He was in my forum group, so we saw each other all the time. We'd actually done a company. We merged 2 little companies together that we had both invested in that turned into a company that then got bought. So lots of activity. And I called him and I said, hey, Jared, it's Brad. I'm putting $50,000 in this thing called Techstars. Can I tell you about it? And he said, I'm in for 50. What is it? And I told him very quickly. I said, I just met this guy. I need to check him out a little bit. But, 60 seconds later, we got off the phone. Jared's like, that's great. Let's do it. I walked back in the room and I said, all right, Jared Polis is going to do the other check. And that was it. And my line to David that he likes to remind me of is I said to him, as long as you're not a flake or a crook, I'm good. And so it wasn't that it was an unconditional commitment on the spot. But, I made a couple of phone calls and sent a couple of emails to people that I knew that probably knew him. And everybody said, yeah, this is a good guy and this was a real thing. And off we went. And that's how Techstars got started.
It is an incredible story. And that was a 15-minute meeting.
Less. I think we were done in 10. I think David, at the end, if you've ever met David, when you're finished, you kind of look at each other and there's nothing to say.
Yeah. Well, in Techstars today, just brief snapshot.
Sure. Techstars today is a global organization. It's funded about over 4,000 companies around the world. It's got a number of very large, successful businesses, a number that are public companies or large acquisitions. Brands people might know that came through Techstars would include a company called PillPack. If you get your medication from Amazon, that's the core of that business. Another popular company that's still very active is called DigitalOcean, which is one of the large hosting businesses. But there are many, many examples of it. And one of the goals of Techstars has been something I started labeling globally democratizing entrepreneurship. So initially, we just ran these programs in Boulder for a year or two, but eventually we started doing accelerators outside Boulder. And then many other things to help founders at the very beginning of their journey, including things like Startup Weekend.
So there are so many other topics that I would love to plow through, but I do want to reserve a few minutes for take a couple of questions that the audience can send online to Chris. He'll pick one or two questions for us. But before we do that, let's touch on the fact that the audience we're speaking with right now are in an emerging market where there are a lot of barriers. There's not enough role models. There's not much smart capital ready to help people. There's very little founder connectivity. I mean, like you're familiar in working with emerging markets, of which here in upstate New York we would consider to be an emerging market. Not a lot of startup density. So as you think about our audience for entrepreneurs across borders that are online right now, if you could make some suggestions related to Give First on where they could be putting some energy to capitalize on what you've just shared in your journey, what might that be?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things that are really immediate and powerful. One is, again, this idea of building a positive feedback loop through the relationships. So just the mere fact that there's a group of people who are connected in this organization, that connectivity, both physically proximate in the geography between founders, but also across the border, the borders that exist with you, with this organization, with the other founders that you're connected to. That network is an essential starting point. If you go back to the beginning of the story, like that moment for me that was so transformative was showing up one day at this Birthing of Giants and looking around and going, wow, there's a whole bunch of other people that are doing the same thing I'm doing, and they're struggling with the same stuff I'm struggling with. And I can talk to them without a filter. I can talk to them about the good and the bad. And again, everybody has their, posturing and positioning, but the quicker you can get through that, in the network dynamic is incredible. Second, it's not that Give First remember, it's not an obligation. It's not putting all of your energy into things this way. It's incorporating this philosophy into the way that you operate, especially as you start to have some success. And so you start to have some success and you look around in your network and you say, well, how can I contribute back to the other people in the network, but in ways that are not obvious, in ways that are not transactional, in ways that don't require a financial relationship. And I can give some good examples. I'll give an example from our life. You may not remember this. When I moved to Boulder, I had started, I was doing all this investing. It's 1995. TriNet's now starting to turn into a thing. I had a bunch of relationships with people where I was charging them money each month as a retainer for consulting fees. So, if you wanted my time, for X dollars, you get a little bit of my time. For Y dollars, you get a little bit more of my time. For Z dollars, you get even more of my time. And I would invest in the companies too, and I would often get some equity for sitting on the boards. And then I had other relationships, and I'm not going to remember exactly what it was, but I think the relationship with TriNet was every customer I referred to TriNet, I got $1,000 for, something like that. So these companies, when I would refer them to TriNet would send me a small check for a little bit of time. Like that went on for a couple of months. I woke up one day and I was making plenty of money from all of these relationships, but it wasn't satisfying. And some of it was that it was obligatory. Like I was in this position where at Saturday afternoon, if somebody called me and they were paying me a monthly fee, I had to respond to them. And if I didn't, even if they weren't paying me the monthly fee that got them response on Saturday or whatever that was, I can't remember now, they weren't happy. And so at the end of 1 month, I fired everybody. And I just said, look, I don't want a financial relationship here. I'm going to keep helping you. I said to everybody, if you want to give me to give you back the stock, I'm happy to give you back the stock if you don't feel like you're getting the value from me. Nobody took me up on that. Everybody was happy to continue to have me have the stock. I think everybody was relieved not to write me a check each month. But I think the value equation increased. In other words, because I was no longer beholden to people a certain way, there was a looseness in the relationship. I remember the same thing with TriNet. It's like, I don't need the referral fee. You're a great business. Let me just send people to you. And TriNet ended up building a pretty big book of business in Colorado, just as a result of a bunch of those references. So sort of the same idea, I use this as an example early on. Once you start to have some success, look at yourself as somebody who can contribute to the ecosystem without necessarily having to extract something from the ecosystem, because that'll help the ecosystem accelerate. Yep. And then maybe the last is I've failed at a lot of things. Had a lot of companies I've tried, a lot of things I've started that didn't work. I've had plenty that do. And over the course of a lifetime, to be successful, the hope is more succeed than fail. And you don't have to have more individual number of things succeed than fail. Just the magnitude of the success has to be bigger. That's an interesting mental reset for a founder, because it's very different than the reset that people have, I think, in the context of a job. And as a founder, what you're doing, you may only found one company in your life, but that company is an endless series of experiments. You have a hypothesis, you run an experiment. Most of the experiments fail. You learn from the experiment and learn from didn't work. You change your hypothesis, you run another experiment. And when the experiment does work, you do a bunch more of it. And so that mindset that you're constantly trying new things and learning from what doesn't work and then applying that back in to what you're trying again to eventually find what does work is such a fundamental part of being a founder. And again, very, very different than almost all other forms of work, where you're trying to get to a particular outcome, but you don't have the same tolerance for making mistakes, where the mistakes really are the fuel for learning rather than the judgment of whether you were right or wrong.